Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 78 of Retuning Your Firm. It's quite a large number, isn't it? Friday, the 16th of September, 2022. It's been a very eventful couple of weeks, and I think it hasn't finished yet. Obviously, bank holiday on Monday with the Queen's funeral. But today we're looking at some other topics, the moves to make a change from the wall-to-wall coverage. So communications. To what extent are firms guilty of slap and dash? Are they actually really focusing on making sure that their content gets to the right audience at the right time in the right way? And Matt will be telling us a bit more about that. The other area is operations, and maybe in particular transformation, in the sense of how can you reorganize yourselves in order to be ready for retuning, if you like, what's coming down the horizon, and taking us, I think, probably therefore into money, because I think the money is going to be very much a key driver, because I think lots of firms have had fantastic 2021s, but all of a sudden now employee costs are going up, clients perhaps not quite as active as they were, quite a squeeze happening there. First of all, I would like to introduce myself, Richard Chaplin, and say that I am absolutely delighted to be with you again today and to introduce our wonderful panel. So first person I'd like to introduce is Andrew Manning. Andrew is the Managing Director of No Progress, and he's going to be talking to you today about the need for firms to embrace commercial, financial, and operational transformation. And that's a massive, massive agenda. So I'm sure we'll be honing in on some really interesting elements. Maybe where do you begin? Where do you start the process? And he'll be explaining his ideas about that. Andrew, if you don't know him, has been on the show as in the audience many times, and he's also been the CEO of a couple of law firms, has a background in surveying, currently working in academia, so has a fascinating set of insights that he can bring. So welcome, Andrew. Very lovely to have you on the show. Our second panelist is Matt Baldwin. Matt is the Managing Director of Coast Communications, and communications it's always been important, but I think looking into the next year, communication is going to become even more important. We've all seen sort of everybody throwing everything they can at LinkedIn and almost becoming a sort of impossible to find anything as a result. So how can you overcome that splash and dash and actually do something that's really much more focused and relevant to your key clients? So looking forward to what Matt has to say. Well known to everybody who's been on the show, watched before. Welcome, Francesca Lagerberg, who is, as you are probably aware now, the Chief Executive Officer of Baker Tilly International. But she's still Francesca, which is the main thing. So welcome today, Francesca. So before we sort of move into the sort of the main show, I just really wanted to kind of talk about some of the things that are going on in the forum. And despite the 2-month break, and actually it's 9 weeks, it's been a long time since we were talking to each other. Still hundreds of people are watching the videos from past shows every month. So don't miss out, they're there. And I think they are a really good resource, so please use them. Mentor Match, well over 50 mentorships now have been in place, which is great. And the program not only matches people, but also provides a great place for them to track all aspects of the relationship. So it really is a one-stop shop, which is great. The peer groups have been really active for the last few months, which is really awesome. The 4th firm-wide leader one is now active. We've got a couple next week, in fact, for EAs, which is a whole new area, but some of the managing partners said we'd really like our EAs to join a peer group for them, for their peers, because that way they can be more effective at helping us. And it's also showing that we're investing in them. And bite my hand off, I think, is probably the response that I think Claire's been getting from the people she's been talking to. We also have another HR peer group that's launching before the end of the month. And we're even looking to start a peer group for chief marketing officers of some of the international firms. So a lot happening in the peer group space, which is great. And if you're not sure about what that is and how to do it, then obviously happy to let you know. And we've got 5 forum events happening over the next few weeks from all the specialist groups, plus the first management team together session since March 2020, which is looking at ways to maintain your firm's culture. So a lot happening there, which is exciting. What I will do though now is just move on to the polls. And if you recall the poll results, and I use this quote every time because it's pretty amazing. So your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during this dynamic time. Now, when we were last looking at the polls, we did one, and again, this seems like ages ago, but 15th of July, that was literally the last show we organized. And we looked at learning and development and its maturity. And I'm afraid the message that came back was hasn't significantly improved. Let's look back at what the messages were. Very few people, very few managers see formal learning as a collaborative effort, or indeed informal learning as forming part of the learning ecosystem. In other words, put somebody in a training course, tick, job done, move on. It doesn't work. Very few people are actually thinking about, well, how are we going to translate that knowledge that has been shared in the classroom into new behaviors, or to actually, and this is a scary thought, find some real explanations for why there's a gap between current and desired performance. And is training really the answer, or is it poor management? That's, in other words, people have got the expertise, but they can't do it because management isn't helping them with its contribution. Learning transfer, it's kind of seen as a bolt-on. Just, oh, what do you mean learning transfer? Well, the point is, measurement of learning effectiveness is, to me, all about behavior change, not about how good you are at reciting what you've been told in the classroom. The happy sheets, sure, but what else data is being collected? Not a lot. Is there an L&D strategy? So, yes, but it's not really coupled with corporate strategy. Very few people are seen as really being connected and contributing to the way the courses come together. And the L&D team, well, that's just a place you go and ask for training, isn't it? Or look it up on the catalogue or something. So sorry to say that this is an area where maturity is somewhat immature, I think, is the only answer I can give on that one, which is a bit strange. There's a couple of charts here. They probably can't read them because you've got a phone or something like that, so I'll just quickly take you through them. Very few firms, I mentioned, are looking at the cause of gaps between current and desired performance. Now, what that means in practice is that every request for a learning initiative is put through a formal performance diagnostic process, and this is the blue bit, is 0. It was a little bit more when we did the thing back in 2020, slightly different group, obviously, which when learning development initiatives are considered, each requires a business case as to why the course will be fix the perceived performance problem. Well, a little bit less than 20% thought that was the truth. A lot of people just said, people just asked for a course without even doing a performance diagnostic at all. Not ideal. So the second of the 3 slides, learning transfer is seen as a bolt-on. In the ideal world, it's embedded into the design of every learning and development initiative from the beginning. Well, that's less than 10%. That's the blue one. It's done as a bolt-on. That's about 36. Some discussion is held. That's half. There's not much going on there. And the last one of these slides, delegates are expected to discuss courses with their manager, but changes are not expected. Well, that doesn't really get you very far. In fact, all 10% are expected to implement and share what they learned and are given the space and opportunity to do so. So I think there's a big mismatch here between, I'll use the word training, which is probably the word that a lot of people think about, and training courses, and how are those how is that knowledge shared? And I know Andrew, who's coming on later, is say teaching the business school, and how you actually as a prof, as a presenter, how do you actually not just help your students know what they need to know, but help them change the way they approach their life when they move into a business world is quite interesting, I think. So actually, somebody once said the first thing we need to do is to untrain them from all the things they learned in business school so we can train them how to work for us, but that's probably a little bit unfair. Let's move on now. You're going to love this one. I'm going to ask you to do the same poll that you did a year ago. Now, you probably don't remember a year ago, lots happened, but in the middle of July, lockdown ended and everybody thought that was a bit, a bit scary because we hadn't all finished. And then we ran this poll and we actually ran it in September. And I thought, well, let's find out, can people remember anything about what the impact of lockdown was? Is it all just in the dim and distant past? So I'm very interested to compare. I can't do it live, I'm afraid, today, but I will do it on the summary that comes out shortly. But let's have a look what actually is it all about. So what were the questions we looked at? Well, we thought about the general mood post-lockdown, what's it meant being back in the office, how you're carrying out work in the office, flexibility in working hours when you're in the office, what's been the overall impact, the changes in things like happiness, mental health, conflict. Will lockdown reimposed? Well, a year ago, I said in the next year, and we had some answers on that one, but I thought, well, let's try the next decade. Because one of the things that has come out very strongly, I think, from a lot of people is that politicians are very good at thinking about the next year, less good about the next decade. And therefore, when the pandemic came, it was all a bit of a shock. So what do you as a great audience feel about the next decade? What do you think will happen? If your first question was, what's the general mood at your firm since the end of lockdown? And this is 5 was elation, 1 was panic. So it's around about 4. So that's feeling pretty positive. What's the general attitude at your firm towards being in the office? Now, that's quite interesting. You've still got 15% who are apprehensive, 23% neutral, and about half who are relaxed, of which 15% are very relaxed. There's a small number who are working still from home. To what extent have you reconfigured your office? Because everybody thought they were going to end up completely new reconfigured offices compared with before the pandemic. No change, a third of you. Modest changes, half of you, but nobody significant, no redesign at all. So the idea we're all going to live in a completely new office world, that doesn't seem to have happened. To what extent are you providing greater flexibility in working hours when your people are in the office, sort of early start, late finish, or whatever it happens to be? And that's half of you to a significant extent, 38 to some extent, and virtually nobody saying nothing's changed there. So when people are coming in the office, people are being helpful, trying to accommodate that, make it as easy as possible. What's been the overall impact of the lockdown on your firm? 70% say it's positive and 23% say it's negative. That's quite a very strong message coming back. And now we're looking at, have you observed any changes in the level of happiness since amongst your people? 38% say significant, 31 modest. So 70% saying there's an increase in happiness, which is great. What about the other one to do with mental health issues? There has been a decrease. There's also been an increase, actually. Increase is the 31%. So there is still some tension, which is giving rise to mental health issues. So that's, I'm sure, from the management point of view, of concern. What about the next one? Have you observed any changes in the level of conflict? About the same. So there isn't really anything there that has led to any particular changes, because if you recall, conflict is something that can happen when people feel under stress. And obviously the stress has gone away, but the level of conflict hasn't fundamentally altered. Do you think lockdown restrictions will be imposed in the UK in the next year? Well, 15% of you only think that's likely, with the majority saying unlikely or very likely. However, when we come to looking at the next decade, very unlikely has gone away to 0. Unlikely is 70%, so it's still unlikely, but about 30% of you think it's likely, of which 8% it's highly likely. So that's a little bit of insight as to how you guys are looking 12 months on. And I will now invite our first panelist. Welcome, Andrew. Come and talk to us about transformation.
Thanks, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Richard asked me an interesting question before the show, and I think he mentioned it. Here it is. When does transformation start and when does it finish? And I guess the first thing is to say, what do we mean by transformation? And I think transformation is not the same. Having worked with lots of lawyers, focusing on the words, to me, transformation is not about incremental change or about continuous improvement. It's about a substantive change in a short period of time. When does it start? This may sound like a statement of the obvious, but it's really important. It starts when there's a perceived need, which may be different from a real need, because often the perceived need can come later, for people to actually want to transform. The status quo in any organisation, in any species, I think, look at things, is to protect the status quo. People don't like change, don't want to change. So if you're going to try and transform anything, people need to perceive there's a reason to do so. We've just been talking about with that survey the impact of COVID and it was transformed the way people work overnight. There was a big, and it was transformational there. What else may drive the need for transformation. And again, Richard mentioned a bit earlier, business confidence, what's happening there. And I see two major issues that we've got that professional service firms are facing, and the impact will depend on the size of the firm, and I'll come back to that. But first of all, we see confidence declining in the economy, and declining significantly, and confidence can be a self-fulfilling thing. We worry about the future, so our confidence goes down. We get less confidence, so we don't do positive things. What may that do is likely to mean the volume of work in some areas is going to decline. I think we've seen this week Goldman Sachs saying they're going to get rid of a significant percentage of their workforce because the volume of transactions has gone down and expected to go down. So the volume of work that firms overall can expect may well go down unless supply goes out of the market. And I think in professional services it rarely does. If you make people redundant, they'll tend to go and work for another firm unless they're at retirement age. They tend not to go out of the market. So that also means price comes down, and we saw that in 2008 and things there. So you can see a need for transformation, particularly because revenues may decline. In some areas they may go up, and then we're all seeing costs pressure. I've been heard stories of lawyers, particularly being recruited with 60–70% pay rises to move from one firm to another. So you've got big cost pressures there on the firms and what they can afford to pay people. Then we've got all the other inflationary costs that we've coming through. So all things being equal, you can see there's a need, some big financial pressures coming. The question then is, do you go for a short-term fix, or do you use that as a way of transforming the organisation there? So I can see that that coming ahead. The impact is different. I think the very big professional practices tend to make huge amounts of money, and a decline in partner earnings or whatever is not going to put them on the breadline. But what it will do is make some firms look more attractive than others, and encourage partners to move firms. So whilst it may not be an existential threat in some of these things, it can be a medium-term effect. Smaller professional practices which don't make much money, I can see there being existential threats here. Again, if you're a team of a partner and 2 or 3 fee earners in a regional business, and you lose one of those fee earners because they've been poached to go to a big firm, you've lost 25% of your capacity. You've lost probably 70% of the part contribution to your overheads. So that makes big problems. So I can see a need to transform in some firms becoming more acute in the next few months and years. How to transform is a different thing, which I will answer questions about perhaps a bit later, but not go into now because it's a massive subject. But it's difficult, and people only appreciate the transformers at the time. Once you transform them, they tend not to appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I think, that's a really important point, that you have to have a burning platform. I remember somebody once said to me that you can't change people. People have to want to change. And the challenge there, I guess, is that within a firm, you have many voices as the leader taking you in different directions. So you have to try and work out where's the consensus, where's the way people want to go, because otherwise you may end up splitting your firm for other reasons. Right, I'm now absolutely delighted to introduce our second panelist, and this is Matt Baldwin. Good morning, Matt. And Matt's coming to talk about communication and how you can become just a bit more focused in your comms. Over to you, Matt.
Professional services firms have, for as long as I can remember, been prolific creators of content, the articles, the insights, seminars and events for their clients and referrers and prospects. It's sort of been the bedrock of professional services marketing and remains so. My very first job in a law firm in '96 with the now long gone Wild Sapt involved actually managing what it called its publications library, which was literally a dark room stuffed full of spiral-bound technical updates on banking, finance, and insurance law. They were there to be shared with clients, but the reality was most of them never really saw the light of day. But if you fast forward 25 years, the COVID pandemic saw pretty much every firm of every size, law and accountancy firms and consulting firms, creating COVID hubs, sharing up-to-date content, often 3 or 4 times a day to reflect then what was a very rapidly changing landscape. Some firms have taken this to quite sort of extreme levels. If you look at firms like Tencent Masons with its Outlaw program, they're publishing something like 2,000 articles a year and have a team of 5 full-time journalists creating this content. With some of the other law firms that we've seen, they're producing sort of 30 or 40 articles a week. And you do question how many of them are being read by the audience that they're intended. Now, of course, that mix isn't just articles now, it's video, it's podcast and webinars and things like this. There's a really good reason why firms do this. I think it does give those clients the insights that they want and need, and it's a great way of starting conversations with clients. I think for existing clients, it helps strengthen those relationships as well. It's sort of that value add there. Increasingly, they're a very helpful way of demonstrating the firm's culture and values. And I think for those that create these articles, these videos, there's an enormous sense of pride in doing so, even if it is perhaps just their mothers and fathers that end up reading these sorts of things. And I would argue professional services firms are sort of increasingly looking like publishing businesses. But unlike a publishing business, there doesn't seem, or in most firms, there doesn't seem to be someone there coordinating this and acting almost as an editor that you do see in a newspaper or a magazine. And increasingly so, I believe there should be someone in firms taking that responsibility. I think there is this inherent tension between marketing and the fee earning teams within firms. I think partners will often question how, so if you've been in a role for 10 or 20 years, how can a marketing person ever understand the knowledge that you've accumulated over that career and turn that into these content pieces? And in doing that as an editor, I'm not suggesting that these people don't write and don't create content, but there is some kind of strategic oversight to there. And it's a call to move away from the spray and pray approach to content marketing. To give you an illustration, as I interviewed last month the GC at Vodafone, Andy Yorston. He told me that he received something like over 100 emails a week from law firms offering him insights, pieces of thought leadership. And he told me that most of them go unopened. He just simply doesn't have the time to read this. It was interesting. He told me actually the shorter, punchier insights, sort of the 300 to 500 word pieces, are the pieces that he is more likely to open, and even more so if they come from someone, a name that he recognizes. And it's that 2-minute read that he is after when he does open these pieces. And this is backed up by some research that we did with Meridian West, a consultancy we work quite closely with. They did a survey of over 500 CEOs, and they said exactly the same. They want these short, punchy insights. They also said, however, if they want behind those short, punchy insights, the meat, the detail, the technical insights, should they want to explore that subject further. And I think sort of with this landscape where firms are creating so much stuff, where there is so much demands on our time, that I think firms need to take this much more strategic approach to their content programs. And I think the publishing world is the inspiration where they should look from. I would also argue that editor role should sit firmly in your marketing and business development team. I think most marketers and BD people at the moment are very, very busy and probably don't have the expertise or the skills to do that role. But I think bringing in someone who does will help firms really get to grips with their content programs. They should, that role, they'll understand what clients want, how they want to receive it, whether it's best as a written piece, best as a video or audio piece, even down to the times of day when content should be distributed. Now, that role, they won't necessarily understand the technical content, but I don't think they need to. They will understand how that content is likely to land with a client. And they should ultimately be the arbiter of whether a piece of content ever sees the light of day through a firm's official channels or not. I mean, if you take the example of, I don't know, The Sun, The Times, The Economist, The Yorkshire Post, even Hello Magazine, it's the editor that decides what runs in those newspapers and magazines, and not the individual journalists. And I think it's probably about time that professional services firms did the same.
Fantastic, Matt. Thank you very much. And obviously, great food for thought there. So on which happy note, happy to like to invite Francesca to share her thoughts. If you recall, Andrew talking about transformation and what drives the need in a world where the confidence is falling away. And excuse me, Matt saying everyone should have an editor and not allow their content to be driven by the front line. So over to you, Francesca.
No, thank you. Two great talks, two great things to think about. Maybe I'll start with a bit of transformation. Always good for a Friday. And there was a couple of things that really struck a chord with me. Probably something that comes off the back of what I'll call the COVID dividend. I think we've been through an extraordinary period in professional services where, despite some of the very difficult conditions that people have had to deal with, there has actually been a huge amount of productivity in professional services firms, and many have had this so-called dividend where they've been receiving a lot more work, or they've been very flat out for long periods of time. That's come through into the bottom line as well as into the top line, and we're now perhaps getting back to whatever the new normal really is going to look like. And there's a piece there around what do you do with the money, how do you spend that wisely, what do you invest, what do you distribute, and there's also a really interesting piece around the real concept of transformation, which is fascinating to think about, because I sometimes think that people call things transformation that are actually efficiency, and call things transformation that really about tweaking what's already there. And how do you really transform your business? Is that from changing completely the way that you work in a dramatic way, 4-day weeks, completely different ways of operating? Or is it about digital transformation? Or is it about other forms of transformation that are actually changing your delivery mechanisms, or the way you approach clients, or the various things that you do? And I think it's a word that gets bandied around in lots of different ways. So that's so interesting to think about what really is transformational and what actually is about what we've always done, which is improving and evolving and getting better. What takes you to that next level, and how committed is a firm to invest the time, energy, capital to do it? And I expect all of us fall into varying degrees of category of the things we really want to transform, and the things that really are more about just getting a little bit better at what we do. There's incremental changes that have a big effect. So very interesting to see how the professional service market goes, what is truly transformational and what is more about the continuing ability for us to drive our work in the most effective and efficient way. On the comms side, oh, well, music to my ears. I receive tons of emails from people, and you kind of go, I'm really not sure why I've received some of them, because they seem so counterintuitive to whatever they may have seen on LinkedIn or whatever's driven them to send me that content. But so the personalization of communication, I think, is a hugely interesting piece. I think as someone is broadcasting a message, it's a thought leadership kind of piece. It's a story, putting it out on a social channel where you may be able to attract some people who are really interested in that. And I agree with you, that pithy short read. Those 2-minute reads, love those, quick, short, get the message. But if the scattergun effect of putting things out, you look at some of the things you receive and you go, how much energy has gone into this sort of opus that I've just received, and how little of it is actually going to get read, and how little of it is actually driving the end game of why you're communicating at all. What's it for? What are you trying to achieve? Is it about being really clear about showing your credentials in a particular area or sector? Is it something that you're actually really you have really got something to say? You've got something new or a take on something that's got a real opinion piece to it that you are keen to share. And very often you get a lot of data and information and you're not really sure what it's actually trying to do. And I think in a very media saturated world, because we all get input from LinkedIn, emails, social media of any description, what is it that what's the real message? And sometimes I think it's not clear what the message is trying to do, other than show that that particular organization has put something out that week. And I do wonder if perhaps we put a lot of pressure on our Marcoms team to put stuff out as opposed to put out stuff that's really pithy and relevant. And also I do love targeted pieces that are actually going, we want to talk about this thing. If you're not interested, don't read it. You want to talk about this thing. Really clear what the message is, really clear about what it's intended to do. So huge fan on edited content, huge fan on being really clear of who the target is. And something incredibly important about volume isn't king here. We're not the Daily Mail Online. We're actually trying to do something that's a very different kind of approach in terms of reaching out to clients. So if all that's happening is you're putting out volume, is that really achieving the end game? What about maybe a little bit less, a little bit more focused? Back to you, Richard.
Yeah, sort of the word that comes to mind is purpose. And in a sense, I think that's true of not just your comms, but also your transformation. The question that we as kids were asked all the time, which was why, but as we get older, we kind of now talk about how rather than why. I suspect that's the way I look at it anyway. So I'd now like to move to the panel session. So I will, if I may, invite Andrew. And I just really wanted to talk a little bit about one of the point Francesca made about this sort of differentiation between what you might just call efficiency gains, business as usual, and genuine transformation. And you know, if somebody who is sort of thinks they need genuine transformation, assuming that need is in place and accepted, what are the sort of things that they might then have to contend with, in your experience, having worked in a number of professional firms?
I think in terms of the contention, and I agree absolutely what Francesca said about you've got this incremental change which we should all be doing, and continue. Transformation means it's becoming something different. And as I said, there needs to be a reason that compels you to become something different. But a key thing you need to identify is, what does something different look like? And until people can agree on that, so you've got the why bit, Richard, you talked about, and you mentioned how, but before how, you've got the what. What are we transforming to? And one of the challenges is to get people to agree what looks like, because inevitably you'll come up with 3 or 4 different whats, and then you've got to do that. So and then you're going to have all the tangible things that the whats look like, and the cultural things and your operational processes. So effectively, you're designing a new organisation, a new business, and all the components. And if you don't think of that, but you've got to start from what does it look, what's its purpose, and can it survive competitively doing that? Because we've all seen, and I'm as guilty as this. You come up with 10 ideas, and 8 of them are rubbish. You just don't know which 8. So you need, this what needs to be something that's compelling, that people want to go from here. We don't like this, or this bit isn't sustainable, to we're going here, and we really like this. And if you've got the choice of that, I think the next bit then, in terms of the how, you need to show people a route map of how to get there. Well, okay, Mr. Manning, you showed this fantastic future over there. How on earth do we get there? And then once you've persuaded them that, you then need to say, I'm the leader who's going to take you there, rather than just a person who's drawn a map. And then you've got this journey, haven't you? And things will go wrong on the journey. You'll get lost, or other things will happen. And how do you carry? So I think it's very much about, we're here. Why isn't here sustainable? And people need to be persuaded is not sustainable, and it's not just about shrinking here. And then it's, but we want to go over here, and over here is much better than here. Yeah, well, just looks a little bit better. Can't be bothered, thanks. Here is much better. So you're selling this vision then, aren't you? Your comms come into that. Then you're designing it. Then you're saying, here's how we get there. And here's the timeline and all the resources. Because if you don't put the resources and stuff into it, I was talking that with some executive MBA students this week. You know, one of the reasons you see all these change programs fail, and we all do that, we've got a special project and we just put our best people on it, but they still have to do their day jobs. So you don't backfill it, so you don't resource it properly, and then carry people through it. If you don't do all of those things, you won't get there. And you end up with this kind of bastardized version of what you've got, or something that doesn't do. So what are you transforming to?
That's great. I'll come back to Matt in a second, but just wanted to continue the conversation with Francesca in a way. I'm always interested in this issue about, can you persuade somebody to do something that they're not necessarily interested in doing, and a sense as a leader, how you need to build consensus in order to be actually able to move things forward. In other words, it's not about painting a picture and saying we're going there, please follow, but you have to almost make sure that that picture becomes their picture so that they buy into it. I mean, to what extent do you follow that philosophy or see that as being a good way forward?
Yeah, and I think those of us who spend a lot of time working in partnership type structures know that the old adage that everybody thinks they run the business is very true. And it sort of is, because there's a different kind of model in a partnership to a company and a big corporate. And there's a piece there around getting people to want to be on that journey with you. And that is about influence rather than direct power. How do you sell the story? Why are you bothering? I think to Andrew's point, where's your burning platform that you need to go in this direction? Or where's your massive win that if you were foolish enough not to go down that route, you would really regret it? So I think there's a lot of there around influence. But on certain issues, of course, somebody has to take a lead, or someone has to be willing to make the decision, because the other downside of seeking consensus on absolutely everything is, can you actually get to a decision? And sometimes it's better to make a decision and it be slightly suboptimal than to make no decision and it be really, really a disaster because no one's made the choice. So I think it's a combination. Selling a big transformation, which I think is what we're really talking about, has to win over hearts and minds. You can make the case on the figures, but you do have to also win people's souls, because if you're looking to do something that's so dramatically different, if you haven't got people there with their real belief that this is the right thing to do, or at least a belief that it's worth a try, you're going to struggle to make those big changes, and you can the whole issue could just die a death. But I think there is a massive piece around trying to build the story, showing what the win is, but then ultimately there has to be a decision-making process, because otherwise it becomes one of those things that everyone talks about for years and years and nothing gets done.
Bringing Matt in now, if I may, and really just picking up that last point around you have to make a decision, because no decision can be a worse outcome, which is sort of my very quick paraphrase of what you were saying, Francesca. But what would you say, Matt, is the sort of communication challenges that this is throwing up? I mean, the sense of where you have a leader who sort of wants to lead from the front, then maybe you have one form of support in a common sense. But when you're actually in this more fluid space where you actually do want to win the hearts and minds and you do want to move people forward, how from a communications expert, how do you actually approach that if the leader clearly needs that level of support?
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because the data, you need that data and the numbers there, but actually that's not always going to win over the hearts and minds. And actually, it's the emotional message that you also need to think about. And I think it's not in a firm, it's often those one-to-one conversations, it's winning over groups of people, and actually focusing your communications where it needs to be, rather than trying to encompass everything. I think as well, it's actually, there will be natural communicators within your firm that you want to maybe target and build those relationships with, to help then win them over, bring them on board, and allow that sort of momentum to carry that way. But it is a difficult one, and if you get it wrong very early on, it will head south very, very quickly.
Andrew, just bringing you here, and then Francesca mentioned finances at one point, and it is clearly something that particularly accountants are very, very focused on. What would you say are the sort of financial triggers that are likely to think, we really do need to start thinking about doing something different, genuinely transforming here?
Well, there's the obvious ones that you're about to run out of cash. And it's a statement of the obvious, but a lot of professional practices aren't very good at managing their cash flow and don't necessarily see it coming. So it can be a bit of a shock. I think depending on the profession you're talking about, one of the things that's intrigued me with lawyers, despite having this huge intellectual capacity, they don't like or don't understand numbers very well. And I remember at one big law firm, I had to kind of explain the numbers to people, and I was really, really worried that what I'd be sounding like I'm sort of teaching 3-year-olds maths, and they'd be insulted. But at the end of it, they'll come and say, "That's brilliant! Now we understand it." So, so that's I think the first thing is people who don't necessarily deal with numbers or aren't comfortable with numbers or don't like them, you have to explain it to them, and you have to explain it to them in layman's terms. And I just relate that back into something that both Francesca and Matt said about hearts and minds. My experience of professional service firms, and this is different before, you have to do it the other way around. You have to do minds and hearts. You're dealing with a lot of intellectual, very clever people, and you have to persuade them intellectually you need to change. Then you need the emotional thing. So with numbers, first of all, you have to explain to them the consequences of not doing things. And of course, what they don't want to do is, and actually, it's their earnings going down. And it doesn't matter how much they earn. You earn £1 million a year. If you're spending £1,001 a year, falling to 900,000 is painful. So it's understanding what the triggers are and explaining the consequences, but also explaining a solution to people. Because otherwise, you go, "Oh shit, the numbers are terrible. What do we do? Panic, panic." You need to be able to say, "Well, here's what we can do about it." And again, I've been involved with firms where partners had to put more money in, or doing things that they don't want to do, but they will do it if you explain why they have to do. And my experience, anything you can explain finances simply, but it's a skill in explaining it simply. And accountants aren't necessarily particularly good at that because they understand it so well, and the mystique, they're like just breaking it down. But without money, your organisation's stuffed. And the other thing they don't like, if you want to poke the hornet's nest or whatever, is start talking about remuneration and how you share the pie out. Because you might say, "Oh, to shrink the pie," and someone say, "Yeah, but I'm still having a piece the same." If you say you want to pay them more, and the pie's no bigger, you've got to have less. Intellectually, they like it. The moment their pay packet's less, you're not so popular.
Yeah, there's that wonderful word which I think is very common in the trade union world of relativities, and making sure that we are. And they always say the most interesting partner meetings are the one where they were sharing out the pie because they go on the longest and usually generate the most energy within the room. Francesca, of course, in accountancy, I suppose we have a slightly different issue, which is the smaller the equity, the more likely they are to go and badger the finance director for information. It sort of kind of works the other way around, I suspect. I love that expression you came up with a minute ago of COVID dividend. And what was quite interesting from the poll was that 70%, I think it was, if I recall, of people said that actually, 69 anyway, thereabouts, said actually, yes, the pandemic or lockdown, which was the practical effect for most people, has been beneficial for the firm. Do you think that dividend is waning? Well, where do you see it now?
Yeah, it is one of those sort of strange quirks of those dark pandemic years, is because a lot of people weren't going anywhere. They kind of worked harder, or maybe not having to commute. They had more time to do more hours. So an awful lot of firms found that their overarching profits actually went up. Or also, you've got lots of clients who were just really struggling. You know, what do I do? How do I do it? And they were seeking advice, perhaps higher premium advice, because of the complexities they were having to manage. So a lot of firms, I mean, just look at some of the public results that go out, just, you know, they can see the volume of increase in top line and bottom line revenue. Is it waning? It's a tough one, Richard. I think it's probably true that the world hasn't got any less complex. There are probably an amazing number of challenges about to come, with many global economies struggling. So perhaps the shift is from some of the more growth areas into the more rescue, recovery, and solvency areas, sadly. But that often means that a multidisciplinary firm is able to ride the wave on whichever side the economy is going. So you're still seeing big growth taking place, but running alongside that, of course, is the massive issue about high cost of living, high inflation, all the things that come with that, and the need for people, or the request of people, to have more money. So I think you're seeing wage bills certainly increasing, and potentially exponentially increasing, as people are looking to keep their talent, bring in new talent, offer something attractive in a very crowded and mature market in many, many parts of the world, certainly in the part of the world we're all sitting in right now. And what's intriguing about that, and I'm sure you're going to do a program on this, Richard, is what else do you offer apart from money? What are the other things that are really attractive to people that go beyond the cost? So if your COVID dividend is waning, or your costs are increasing over and above what the dividend piece is, how do you make yourself an attractive place to be? And there are so many different ways you can do it, but what's the real things that are going to make you stand out from the crowd? So yes, I had dinner with a Swedish colleague, and she is building her business or attracting talent off the back of the non-financial additional value that they provide. So people want to work there because it's a great place to work. Financially, it's pretty even to other similar places. So there's something interesting here about, if your COVID dividend or your revenue opportunities are plateauing or being exceeded by expenses, is there something else that you can be or should be thinking about?
Fantastic. And if I remember, my wife used to work in financial service, and she said, the bigger the bonus, the lower the loyalty. It's quite an interesting way of looking at it. I'd like to thank Anne, who's put a question in, and this is for Matt. You may have seen it already, but the question was, how do you move firms beyond the premise that an email is the best form of communication?
Email can be a very, very useful, very powerful form of communication, but I think it's actually look at what the data is telling you from your email. If your email rates are not getting good open rates, good readership click-through rates, then start looking, asking why. Email is probably, I would probably actually take the question back one step further, is actually look at what you're putting in the email rather than the actual email itself, the delivery channel. And look at what it is, the content that you're creating, and asking whether it is the actual right content to be delivered via email. Are there better ways of sharing that? And it's actually one thing that we've seen that is quite interesting, is there has been a real resurgence in print literature in some professional services firms, purely because of its novelty value. If something well produced, good quality writing and visuals lands on desks, people are thinking, gosh, what's this? They'll flick through it. They may not read everything, but it's a little bit more memorable than one of many, many hundreds of emails sitting in an inbox.
Well, I think that's it. And I always think, and maybe this is rather my simple way of thinking about life, but comms is a little bit like an oil refinery. And you have to make sure that the whatever the liquid is getting from one tank to the other, and therefore you have to know where you're coming from and where you're going to, and then you have to make sure you have the pumps and blocks along the way so that the liquid gets to the other place at the right speed in the right way. And I think a lot of that, therefore, is to say, not worry so much about the channel, but what's the message, what's the audience, and which is the channel that is most likely to get through to that audience in the right way. And often think in marketing, again, it's quite nice to remember that people who get something from 4 different directions at the same time are more likely to take notice. It's a bit like they always say, the CEO, until you've given the same speech 25 times, nobody's really heard it yet. I'm sure Francesca in her new CEO role will find that challenge in due course. But there you go. Well, look, we're now sort of coming towards the end of the show today. So if I may, put onto gallery mode, which is fun. And everyone can see everybody. And what I'd like to do in the last minute is just really to ask each of you to sort of give me what's the one point or one issue that's come up today that you think has really had a sort of impact and resonance with you. And I'll start with Matt, if I may. What's the one thing today, Matt, that you've heard or from anybody or you've made yourself that you think is really interesting and impactful?
I think the power of and the importance of good internal communications as we come out of a COVID landscape and into a very uncertain landscape still, with different ways of working. I think the power of good internal communications has never been more important.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew, what's your takeaway from today?
I think it ties into what Francesca said, and it ties again to something I've been talking to my students about this week, is offering people more than just money for working for your organisation. You know, in simple strategy things, it's, you know, are you competing on a price thing, or are you differentiating with other things? And it ties into lots to organisational mission and purpose, which we all read is more and more important to people. So people need to really want to work for you. And I think that's so right. It ties in with your bigger bonus, less loyalty. You've got to work really hard, and that comes in with transformation. People that I really want to be part of. That is key. And then communication, all this ties together. The unknown then, of course, is how much do they want to work? What's the differential in financial terms before, no matter how much you like working for it, you'll go down the road for an extra 10p or 100,000 or whatever the number is.
Okay, Francesca, it's going to have to be a bit of a short one, I'm afraid, because we're just up to 10.
Okay, on comms, less volume, more focus.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. Thank you for being a great audience. Thank you for the question, Anne. And thank you, Andrew, for sharing his thoughts on transformation. As you say, the how is difficult, but if you don't know where you're going, you certainly won't end up there. Matt, for reminding us that more is less again, but give it focus. And to Francesca for talking about the COVID dividend and the importance of not being scatterguns. So great session as always, back in a couple of weeks with some more interesting panels and guests, and look forward to hopefully having your company then. In the meantime, bye for now.